Welcome to Land Eco Lightning Talks and Thinking Like a Landscape with Dr. Kevin McGarrigle. In this 8-part series on the natural range of variability concept and current departure, I discuss the origins of the concept, definitions and alternatives, applications, and important considerations in the implementation of the concept. In this talk, part 4 of the series, I will discuss reference frameworks and the strengths and weaknesses of these alternative frameworks. Okay, let's get started. First, it's important to recognize that natural range of variability exists in both space and time. Spatial variability is where we have multiple records of some ecological attribute across space, but at a single point in time. Whereas temporal variability is where we have multiple records over time of an attribute in a single place. So in the figure to the right, as we move from left to right, we're talking about a single point in time in looking at variation in ecological condition across space. As we move vertically through that figure, we're talking about a single point in space and looking at multiple points over time for that location. So variability exists in both space and time. NRV requires a reference framework for measuring variability, and the alternative approaches employ both spatial variability and temporal variability, one or the other, or in some cases both. I'm going to discuss 3 approaches in detail, but I'll also mention here that as an alternative to a quantitative approach to NRV, there is always the option of an expert-based approach, using expert opinion to essentially describe what the natural range of variability is for any particular ecological attribute. But I will dismiss this because it's really no longer deemed acceptable and justifiable given these more quantitative and defensible alternative approaches that I'll discuss in detail. And I'll discuss in detail 3 approaches, but with the 3rd approach, I'll also talk about a variation on it. These 3 primary approaches are the Contemporary Reference Condition Approach, or CRC, the Historical Reference Condition Approach, or HRC, and the Historical Range of Variability Approach, or HRV. And these 3 approaches essentially look at variability in space or time. In the contemporary reference condition approach, we're looking at spatial variability in the contemporary landscape, so the top row in the figure. The historical reference condition approach, we're looking at spatial variability, but at a historical snapshot in time, so the 2nd row in the figure. In the historical range of variability, or HRV approach, we're looking at variability for a single site over time, so the vertical column in the figure. It's important that we recognize that there are important trade-offs with the space for time substitutions. The HRV approach, the historical range of variability approach, which focuses on temporal variability, range of variation across time for a given site, it uses simulation modeling to create a relatively complete representation of all the conditions that could have been realized under historical reference conditions. So if we take the site depicted in the red box in the upper left of the figure, we're using a simulation model to simulate what that system at that site could have looked like over time under some reference period conditions. The idea here is that we use a simulation to try to simulate all the possible outcomes that could have occurred under the disturbance regime characteristic of that particular reference period. And importantly here, we recognize that the history of that site is just one realization of what could have happened at that site given the stochastic nature of disturbance and successional processes. We use a simulation model to try to represent all of the possibilities, all of the possible outcomes of what could have happened given the stochastic occurrence of disturbance and succession processes. And in this way, we're trying to capture a complete representation of all the possible outcomes that we could see for a given site under the historical reference period conditions. The spatial variation approaches, the contemporary reference condition and historical reference condition approaches, use space for time substitution. That is, they use the variability across space to represent the variability that would have occurred over time for any given site. So we use the variability across space, because we can observe that in real time, as a substitute for the temporal variability that we're really ultimately interested in. The problem with the space for time approach, as depicted in this figure, is it requires a relatively arbitrary selection of how broad a space to encompass when we describe the natural range of variability. As we expand the breadth of the reference space over which we evaluate the natural range of variability, naturally the natural range of variability will increase because it is scale dependent, as discussed in previous lightning talks. So there's an arbitrary choice involved in choosing the breadth of space to represent NRV in a space per time substitution approach. And this introduces a strong degree of arbitrariness to the whole approach. It's important to keep these trade-offs in space per time in the back of your mind as we go through each of these approaches in detail. We'll start with the contemporary reference condition approach, or CRC approach. In this approach, we have a landscape unit at some specified scale, and we're comparing that to a set of reference sites at the same point in time, the contemporary conditions. And again, we must determine the breadth of sites over which we're going to evaluate NRV, but nonetheless, we are using a space for time substitution approach here to capture the NRV. And this approach has some major advantages. It does not require difficult to get historical data because we are observing the contemporary landscape and measuring it directly, usually with either field or remotely sensed methods. But there's little uncertainty in the conditions, ecological attributes that we measure because we can observe them directly in the current landscape. There's minimal uncertainty in quantifying detailed and specific conditions, again, because we can observe them directly in the current landscape. So these are major strengths of the CRC approach. However, there are some weaknesses. It's difficult or impossible to find good reference landscapes, and this is especially true as the extent of the focal landscape increases, given the idiosyncrasies of landscapes that we have talked about in a previous Land Eco Lightning talk. So, in many cases, it can be extremely difficult, or in some cases, even impossible to find reference sites or reference landscapes, sites that have not been substantially modified by modern human activities, which renders this approach essentially impossible to implement in some cases. Secondly, it's limited to spatial variability at relatively fine scales, so essentially at the kind of site or local level. And this is because it's increasingly difficult to find reference sites as the size of those sites increases. It may be possible to find local areas that meet the criteria for a reference site, but once you get to a relatively large extent, it becomes very difficult or impossible to find areas that meet those reference condition criteria. And of course, lastly, it suffers the arbitrariness of space per time approaches that we've already discussed. A good example of the CRC approach is that by Geronimo et al. In 2019 in a paper entitled Forest Structure and Pattern Vary by Climate and Landform Across Active Fire Landscapes in the Montane Sierra Nevada, published in the Journal of Forest Ecology and Management. In this application, they looked at the Sierras in California, which is a high elevation montane landscape. And they identified reference areas depicted in yellow in the figure, which met a suite of criteria. Most importantly, these were sites that have experienced regular occurrence of fire over the past several decades, such that presumably the vegetation conditions today reflect what the natural disturbance processes would have created at these sites in the absence of human activities or human modifications. And as you can see, these reference sites are scattered and they're far and few between, and they're not fully representative of the entire Sierra landscape, which is one of the concerns or one of the issues with any CRC-based approach. In this particular study, however, they looked at each of the reference areas and they essentially mapped where at the finest scale areas what areas experienced kind of regular occurrence of fires and did not experience uncharacteristically severe fires, as well as a couple of other criteria to essentially delineate patches that met these reference site criteria. And these patches ranged in size from 100 to over 5,000 hectares. And then they used LiDAR data to depict what are called tree approximate objects, or TAOs, to depict the forest canopy, both in terms of the size, the number of trees, the heights of the trees, the size of the canopies, and so forth. And they did this across all of their reference sites and further classified the reference sites based on landscape management unit, essentially terrain, and climate class, as shown in this figure here. And so for reference sites on each of the designated climate classes and on each of the designated landscape management units or terrain classes, they characterized the range of variability in each of several ecological attributes based on the LiDAR TAO data. As you see in this figure, they computed the range of variation in the density of trees, or more specifically, the density of TAOs for each of the climate classes and LMU classes. They also did the same for basal area, for mean tree clump size, and for an open space index based on the percentage of the area greater than a certain distance from the nearest tree canopy. And so by this means, they were able to generate an NRV for each of these four vegetation attributes across a range of site types. Okay, the second approach is the historical reference condition, or HRC approach. It's similar to the CRC approach in that it uses the spatial variation across reference sites to characterize NRV. The main difference here is that instead of the contemporary landscape, this approach uses a historical snapshot of the landscape to characterize the NRV. The major strength of this approach is that it reflects natural conditions, quote, natural conditions prior to major human alterations. Because in this approach, we're looking at an historical snapshot of the landscape prior to major Euro-American modifications of the landscape. And in this sense, presumably, is representative of kind of the natural conditions that occurred prior to modern humans. Another advantage here is that there's minimal uncertainty in quantifying detailed and specific conditions, much like the CRC approach, because where the data is available to implement this approach, usually the historical vegetation data can be measured directly with very little uncertainty, giving us, again, high confidence in our detailed and quantitative conditions. On the downside, however, it does require difficult to get historical data. And in many landscapes, and this is true in many parts of North America, for example, it's virtually impossible to acquire the kind of historical data needed to apply this approach. In some regions, however, especially in the arid Southwest, where the evidence of the historical conditions can persist for decades to hundreds of years, it is possible to implement this approach. It also requires a single snapshot in time, or it reflects a single snapshot in time, as opposed to the variation one would expect over time under a natural disturbance regime. It's also difficult or impossible to acquire good reference site data as the extent increases. So much like the CRC approaches, while it's possible to find reference sites at the local scale, once the size of the landscapes get large enough, it gets increasingly difficult or even impossible to find reference sites at that scale. And it's limited to spatial variability at relatively fine scales for the reasons I just described. And lastly, like the CRC approach, it suffers the arbitrariness of the space for time approach with regards to having to choose the breadth of reference sites for characterizing NRV. A good example of this comes from Abella and Denton in 2009 in a paper entitled Spatial Variation in Reference Conditions, Historical Tree Density and Pattern on a Pinus ponderosa Landscape, published in the Canadian Journal of Forest Research. And this study was conducted in northern Arizona at a number of sites in the area of Flagstaff, Arizona, and surrounding the San Francisco Peaks, just south of the Grand Canyon. And at each of these sites, they were able to document the pre-settlement tree distribution based on evidences, usually stumps, in some cases logs, that persist to the day, persist even today, because of the relatively arid environment. Those stumps and logs decay at a very slow rate. So they were able to go to each of these sites and essentially document where each tree was at the time of pre-settlement conditions. By doing so, they were able to generate a map of what the forest stand structure looked like prior to settlement modifications. And as in the previous study, they then calculated a number of vegetative attributes, the density of trees, the proportion of trees in clumps, mean clump size, and the maximum clump size. And for each of these metrics, they did so across a range of ecosystem types, essentially ranging from dry to wetter sites based on soil characteristics. Okay, the third reference framework approach is the historical range of variability, or HRV approach. For this approach, we actually take a site, or we take multiple sites across a landscape, so across space, and we simulate the variability at each of those scales over time. So in this approach, we're essentially capturing both spatial and temporal variability in each of the ecological attributes under consideration. The major strength of this approach, given that versatility, is that it reflects natural conditions prior to major human alterations, because the approach here involves simulating the disturbance and successional processes characteristic of that historical reference period. Therefore, we're representing in the outcome of the simulation the conditions that could have occurred under that natural disturbance regime. Very importantly, this approach controls for landscape idiosyncrasies. Each site or each landscape at whatever scale is compared to itself over time. So there's no necessary comparison across sites where we're comparing sites that ultimately differ in their underlying geophysical characteristics. Instead, at each scale, we take that site or that landscape and we compare it to itself. So essentially we completely control for any landscape idiosyncrasies that would influence how disturbance and succession interact to create vegetation patterns. Importantly, this approach accounts for temporal variability. which is ultimately the variability that is generally sought after with an NRV approach. Even if we choose a space for time substitution, we're using space for time to really capture what we would expect to occur for variability over time. And there's no uncertainty in quantifying detailed and specific conditions because with a simulation model, we have complete representation of the data in space and time. And so we can quantify the characteristics of the system with zero uncertainty, essentially. And lastly, it quantifies both spatial and temporal variability and can do so at multiple scales, both in space and time. On the downside, however, it is difficult to acquire historical data or understanding that is necessary to simulate the landscape dynamics under historical reference conditions. Secondly, the simulation requires many assumptions. These are the model simplifications, the assumptions that go into any modeling approach. And therefore, one has to have confidence that those assumptions are correct. And sometimes it's difficult to validate those assumptions. And so there's always some uncertainty, if you will, associated with the outcome because of the uncertainty about the assumptions built into the model. And then lastly, it's technically and computationally intensive. So it does require a larger investment of resources and time to implement. A good example of this is our own work published in 2018 in a paper entitled Modeling Historical Range of Variability and Alternative Management Scenarios in the Yuba River Watershed on the Tahoe National Forest, published as a Forest Service General Technical Report. In this study, we used a simulation model to simulate changes in vegetation patterns over time, as you saw in that animation, and from that derived ranges of variability in a variety of ecological attributes, a couple of examples shown in the figures on the bottom. The first one showing the variability in the contagion metric, measure of overall vegetation clumpiness over time. And on the right, showing the variability in developmental stage or several stage classes, ranging from open through sapling, pole, small, medium, and tall tree, where the box and whisker plots represent the historical range of variability expected in each of these several stage classes for the landscape, and partitioned here between what we expect over time under historical reference conditions, the HRV, or what's shown in the blue bars, comparing that to what we see in the current landscape across space. So if we use the spatial variation in the current landscape to describe the variability, that's shown in the red bars. And we're able to do this with a variety of additional ecological attributes. I want to finish with a reference framework that is kind of a takeoff on the HRV approach. And I'll refer to this as an aspatial historical range of variability, or AHRV. And I include this approach mainly because it's quite popular and it's perhaps been around the longest. And it's widely used because of its relative simplicity, as you'll see. In this approach, the user defines what's called a state and transition model, where the user defines a number of discrete states, oftentimes 3 to 5 states. In this example shown here, you see a 5-state model where each of those boxes in the figure represents a discrete state in the seral development of the vegetation. So in this case, an early development stage, a couple different mid-development stages depending upon canopy closure, and a couple late development stages based on canopy closure. And the user defines these states and defines the transitions between these states and the probabilities associated with transitioning from one state to another under any number of disturbances, in this case based on fire disturbance. And This is simple in the sense that it collapses the complexity of vegetation composition and configuration down to a small set of discrete states. So it's fairly easy to grasp, it's fairly easy to communicate, but it's overly simplified representation of vegetation composition and structure. The issue with this approach is that it's aspatial and it's atemporal. That is, these states are defined kind of in an aspatial or non-spatial way because it doesn't correspond to mapped units. It corresponds to a unit of undefined extent that exists in one of these states and how it might transition from state to state over time under a natural disturbance process. It's also kind of atemporal in that time is not explicit in the model. We simply simulate disturbance processes and the probabilities of their causing transitions from one state to another. But the most important thing here is that it's aspatial. It doesn't explicitly identify the scale at which the NRV is being derived for. But there are some major strengths to this approach, hence its widespread use. First, it does reflect natural conditions prior to major human alterations because the transition probabilities, the rates of disturbance, are presumably based on an understanding of the pre-settlement conditions, the natural conditions prior to major human alterations. So in this sense, it's very similar to a straight-on HRV in that it's designed to represent kind of natural conditions prior to major human modifications. And like an HRV, it accounts for temporal variability in that the simulation does attempt to simulate all the possible outcomes that could have occurred historically under that disturbance regime. It's also computationally very simple and fast, and in most cases using a model known as VDDT to implement this. It's in fact can be done in essentially real time, whereas a true HRV is a spatially explicit simulation and oftentimes can take days to weeks or even longer to run a single simulation. It's a widely used approach, and it is first developed for use in the Landfire program, which I had mentioned previously. And it produces easily understood outputs because essentially we get a range of variation for each of the designated states or stages in the state and transition model. On the downside, however, it is limited to these user-defined states and transitions. So it is essentially an oversimplified representation of the complexity of vegetation composition and configuration, which again could be seen as a pro and a con. It's also an expert-based model, so the parameterization of the state and transition model, again, usually done using this VDT model, is based on expert opinion. It's generally not empirically based. Thirdly, it only deals with landscape composition, as I've already mentioned, these defined states. There's no way to essentially evaluate the NRV in any measures of landscape configuration. And as we've talked about in previous Land Eco talks, incorporating composition and configuration is really critical to getting a complete understanding of the landscape patterns. There's also no explicit spatial or temporal scale for the calculations. And as we've talked about at length in previous talks, NRV, like any landscape pattern analysis, is entirely scale dependent. And because we can't really assign a scale to the analysis for this approach, it's really difficult to know what the NRV means because it's agnostic to scale. And lastly, there's no spatial context for the calculations because it is an aspatial model, which means there's no way to control for landscape idiosyncrasies, such as there is in a true HRV, where each site is evaluated against itself over time. An example of this approach would be the Hugo et al. 2015 publication entitled A New Approach to Evaluate Forest Structure Restoration Needs Across Oregon and Washington. published in Forest Ecology and Management. And in this application, they took this region and they developed or applied state and transition models, primarily developed through the Land Fire Program for each of the biophysical settings across this landscape. And then they used the VDBT modeling framework to implement the state and transition modeling framework, and from that derive a natural range of variability in each of the states. And this figure depicts one of the results, showing here for each of the 5 states across the x-axis, showing the range of variation in the box as simulated using the VDBT model, and then comparing that to the current condition depicted by the bar, showing states that are either over or underrepresented in the current landscape. Okay, so those are the major approaches, reference frameworks for describing and quantifying NRV. And the major take-home message for today's talk is that there are several NRV reference frameworks available, and they differ markedly in their strengths and weaknesses. It's important to remember that space for time substitution frameworks, such as the CRC and HRC approach, trade off less uncertainty in the detailed and specific measured characteristics of the vegetation with variability measures against the more uncertainty due to landscape idiosyncrasies, because they're unable to control for landscape idiosyncrasies, and the limited spatial scales of application, because they're generally limited to relatively fine or local scales. HRV simulations are in fact ideal because they capture both spatial and temporal variability, and they account for landscape idiosyncrasies, and they can be applied at a wide range of spatial and temporal scales, but they do require parameterization and calibration of a complex simulation model. All right, this is Dr. Kevin McGarrigle signing off from this episode of Land Eco Lightning Talks. I hope this talk has been helpful, and I hope you join me for my next lightning talk. In the meantime, keep on thinking like a landscape.